Good morrow, lords and ladies, and welcome back to another session of our studies of medieval Europe. Today's topic of conversation will be the medieval church, and we're going to break it up into two parts as we have done the earlier sessions so far. And part one of our studies of the medieval church will kind of focus on the political angle of things. So, what will we be looking at specifically here today? We'll kind of set the stage by looking at some of the teachings that the Catholic Church is giving to its followers, specifically in regards to how to achieve salvation during this time period. That's going to be really important in understanding how the church is going to flex some of its political muscle a little bit later on, understanding what they believe about salvation. And we'll also take a little bit of a look at what the average parishioner really understands or knows about the Catholic Church during this time period. We're also going to meet the two types of clergy that existed in the Roman Catholic Church during this time: secular and regular clergy. Who are they? What do they do? What's the difference? And we'll also find out about an incredibly important role that simple folks like monks played in the preservation of knowledge in medieval society. Very, very important role these guys had. We'll learn about that today. And then we'll start to see the church begin to get political. We'll see how the Roman Catholic Church, the spiritual entity, starts to take on a political role after the fall of the Roman Empire, and how that political role ultimately leads to lots of corruption in the Roman Catholic Church. So that's where we're headed today. Thus, without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. All right, so during the Middle Ages, obviously the Catholic Church is the dominant spiritual influence in Europe. The Romans accepted Christianity, and even after the fall of Rome, the Christian church, Catholic Church in Western Europe, remained the main religion, remained the dominant religion. And the Catholic Church taught to its followers during this time that all people were sinners, and that the only way to achieve salvation, that is to say, the only way to get to heaven, was to take part in what the church called the Holy Sacraments. Now, the sacraments are basically sort of like the formal church rituals of the Catholic Church. They start really towards the beginning of your life, and they go all the way to the end of your life. They include things like baptism, penance, that's confession, confessing of sins, the Eucharist, for non-Catholics, that's the communion, confirmation, matrimony, that's getting married, anointing of the sick, and holy orders. So these are all the sacraments, and the Catholic Church taught that if you wanted to get to heaven, you had to do all the sacraments. If you didn't do the sacraments, then you couldn't get to heaven. That's what the church taught to its followers. And speaking of those followers, people living during this time period were deeply, deeply religious individuals. And given how rough this time period was, and how poorly a lot of people lived, for a lot of folks, the most important thing in their life was religion, because they felt like the one thing they really had to look forward to in life was death and then going to heaven. So they're deeply religious. Religion was very, very important to people. However, most people were not educated. Actually, the vast majority of people were completely uneducated, and quite frankly, they had no clue what was going on at a Catholic Mass. They couldn't understand the Masses. They couldn't understand a lick of what was going on in the Catholic Church services. And that's because the Masses were all said in Latin. And the Masses were said in Latin because the Bible was written in Latin. Because who put the Bible together? The Romans did. And what was their written language? It was Latin. So the Bible's in Latin, the Mass is said in Latin, and you know how many people can understand Latin? Not too many at all. The vast majority of people have no clue whatsoever most of the time what is actually going on in these masses. And it doesn't help that a lot of the priests at the time are very poorly educated, and they don't really preach effectively either. And so what little the average person did learn about Christianity came from images. Imagery was very, very important to the medieval church, because as most people really had no clue what was being said in the masses, they could tell what was going on through imagery, through statues, through paintings, through stained glass windows. These images became very important. It's like when we were all much, much younger and didn't know how to read yet, what did we like to look at? We looked at picture books, and we could tell what was going on in the stories by looking at the pictures. And so this imagery helped people to understand Christianity, but in large part, they had no clue what was going on in the masses, because the masses were all said in Latin. Now, and the people who take part in the masses, or those who lead the masses, are clergy. Clergy are leaders and officials in the church. Your priests, your bishops, your cardinals, popes, monks, nuns, officials in the church, they're clergy. And during this time period, there are two types of clergy in the Roman Catholic Church. You have what's called the secular clergy, and you have the regular clergy. The secular clergy, the word secular comes from the Latin en seculo, which means worldly or of the world or out in the world. The secular clergy, they lived in public. They lived out among the public in the villages, in the cities, in the towns. They lived in mainstream society. And secular clergy is pretty much anyone you can think of that would interact with the public. Priests, bishops, popes, cardinals, things like that. That's the secular clergy. The other clergy, the regular clergy, regular coming from the Latin term en regula, which means regulations or rules, because these folks lived and live their daily lives basically by a very strict set of rules. They live away from mainstream society. The regular clergy lives in these rural areas far away from people in cities because they believe that, the urban areas, the cities, the towns, there was sin there and it would be much harder to live a pure life, so they placed themselves very far away from society. And the regular clergy included people like monks and nuns, and they lived in these isolated areas in their monasteries. Monks lived in monasteries, nuns lived in convents, and they tend to be isolated away from mainstream society. Now, as far as the regular clergy are concerned, these folks, even though they sort of live that very, very humble life, they take vows of poverty, vows of silence. I love that one, by the way. Vows of chastity. These folks are very humble, but they live far away from society, but they play a very important role in society. They spend most of their time praying or engaging in religious activities, but they play an important role because of an important skill that they possess that most other people in Europe do not have. Monks in the monasteries, they knew how to read and write. And remember, the vast majority of people in Europe are completely uneducated. So despite the fact that these folks live a very humble lifestyle, far away from society, they become incredibly important. The ability to read and write really sets them up in a special place. This is a very rare skill set to have. And, if you do come across the rare person who wants to be educated or wants their kid to be educated, you're the person that they go to. When Charlemagne opened his school, the palace school at Aachen, he brought in a monk, Alcuin, to teach at the school because he knew how to read and write. The monks were the educated ones in society. So this rare skill set makes them very important people. And really the most important role of the monks in these monasteries in terms of a historical and a social perspective is preserving classical books, is preserving classical Greek and Latin texts. They would copy these things by hand because they knew how to read and write. And a lot of the information, a lot of the writings that we have that exist still from Rome exist because these guys kept them alive. They recopied them. They preserved them. Monks called scribes would do the job of copying texts in a special room of the monastery called a scriptorium. And basically it's a room, and you've got a table in front of you, and you're seated at a bench, and on one side you have the book that you're copying, and on the other you have a blank book, and you literally sit there and you copy it word for word, line for line, page for page, by hand. There's no copy machines, there's no printing press, there's none of that stuff. You're doing it all by hand, and the work is very difficult. It's very, very time consuming, being done by hand. And on top of that, a lot of it is done in a style that's called illuminated manuscript. Illuminated manuscript is a style in which the book itself is sort of like a work of art. And we can see some examples of illuminated manuscript over there on the right-hand side of the screen, where you get these sort of very beautiful, intricate, hand-painted pictures and designs around the page in sort of these very brilliant colors, which really contrasts with the life in the monastery, that you've got this very drab, dull lifestyle in the monastery, and these beautiful works of art that are the books created in these illuminated manuscripts. So the fact that these guys preserved texts, preserved knowledge that could be passed down to future generations and to us even today makes them incredibly, incredibly important, vital to this time period. Now, also, during the medieval period, we're going to see that the power of the Roman Catholic Church just explodes. It grows exponentially. We know that the primary mission of the Catholic Church was spiritual. But with the fall of Rome and the collapse of central government in Europe, the church becomes very, very central to life in Europe. You see, I mean, for 500 years, Rome was everything in Western Europe. For 500 years, Rome was central government, Rome was stability, Rome was the one thing everybody could look to. But Rome is gone. That's not there anymore. And the one thing that everybody has in common in Western Europe that they can all still look to for guidance and leadership is the church, because they're all Christian. And so as a result, the church begins to take on many political and social responsibilities, leadership responsibilities, because people look to them for leadership and guidance. And so this leads the Pope to eventually become one of the strongest and most important political figures in Western Europe. So the church is becoming political as a result of the fall of Rome. And the Catholic Church is going to gain even more power as time goes on, as they begin to receive donations of wealth and land from nobles who want to perform acts of piety. Maybe they want to grease the palms of the church in the hopes it'll help them gain salvation, or they just want to pay for the education of their children. So the church is getting money and they're getting land. But with this practice, though, of giving money and land to the church, nobles start to try, and kings start to try to gain a little influence over the church. We start to see a power struggle that begins to develop between secular political leaders like lords and like kings and church leadership, because in giving the church land, in some ways the church becomes something of a vassal to these nobles and to these kings. And so the political leaders try to use that to exert control over church matters, especially on their own lands. And these lords and these kings begin to practice something called lay investiture. The laity are like the members who go to the church as opposed to the clergy. And to practice investiture means that you are investiture means you're giving a title to somebody. So lay investiture is the act of a non-church official, like a king or like a noble, bestowing upon someone a high-ranking church position, like bishop or archbishop or abbot or even cardinal, or in many cases even pope. It's the act of non-religious leaders placing people into high-ranking religious positions. And it's a power struggle that ensues now between the church and the political leaders on who really has the authority to put people in these powers. Is it your political leaders who rule the land? Or is it the religious leaders who are supposed to have power over the church? Well, because using lay investiture, nobles and kings are appointing whoever they want as bishops and abbots, and in a lot of cases, they're appointing their close relatives. They're not appointing someone who's suited for the job, who's qualified, who gets that position because they care deeply about their religion or because they're very devout, but instead they're getting their positions because of their wealth, their status, who they're related to. People who are becoming the highest officials in the church are there because of who they're related to, how much money they have, their social status. And so because of lay investiture, we're seeing bishops and abbots are not the most qualified people to fill their jobs. And these people move up the ladder and become archbishops and cardinals and in some cases popes. And so you have very unqualified people who aren't there because they care about the church and care about religion. They're there because of who they're related to, and they're there for the wealth and for the money. And so because they are not there for the right reasons, they become increasingly careless about carrying out their religious duties. And all they begin to care about is the wealth and the power that comes with it. And so this begins to lead to widespread corruption within the Catholic Church, which is a huge, huge problem during the medieval period. And we'll see more of that in times to come. But that's where we're going to wrap it up for today. So we've been through just the basics on church teachings. What did the Catholic Church teach about salvation? That you had to take part in the sacraments to get salvation. We also learned that the average person doesn't really know a whole heck of a lot about what's actually going on in church because they don't speak Latin and the masses are done in Latin. We also found out why monks and nuns, the regular clergy, were very important, the special talent that the monks had, their ability to read and write, and how that was used to preserve knowledge. And then finally, we saw the church become political, why the church became so politically important after the fall of Rome, and we saw how lay investiture is starting to turn the church down a very, very corrupt path. So those are the essential questions. Make sure that you study them. Be ready to talk about them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.